thank you to all the panelists for giving a little brief overview of their organizations or companies. So at this point, what we're going to do is just open it up for questions to the panelists. I'm going to just start it off with a question that I have. Just give you a little bit of time to think about the questions that you'd like to ask either of the whole panel, and they can take it one by one, or if you have a specific question for one panelist, that's also fine. So the first question that I have, which I'm curious maybe what all of your responses are, would be about price discovery. So that seems to be a relatively inexact science still in organic, a little bit of the Wild West. And so I'm wondering if you can shed some light on the price discovery mechanisms at work within your organization or your company, how you come to the prices that you offer farmers, or that you are quoting farmers that are in contact with a buyer. That's the general question. And how can farmers then assess what is a fair price for themselves based on your mechanisms? I'll turn the microphones on for you.
Yeah, I got this one, I think.
All right. Yeah, so everyone wants to take it first?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I can start. I'll do my best to kick this one off. Can you guys hear me?
You might need to hold it in your hand, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. I can kind of kick this one off a little bit. So how do we do price discovery, especially in the organic market? There's a few things that we factor in and a few things that we do that we use to kind of determine our prices. And I'm definitely going to talk from the oat side of it on this one. A lot of what we do, it starts out with a lot of phone calls. And that, it might sound pretty simple, but that's a lot of what it is. You're calling farmers, you're calling other buyers, just trying to figure out what is out there for grain, what are farmers kind of being, or what are they willing to move that for, and you kind of work with that for a while. And then there's a couple other things, like for us, what is really happening in the Canadian market, what's up there for supply, what's here for supply, what are farmers putting in the ground, and then surprisingly, the exchange rate. That does play a pretty big role. Like in our diagram before, over half of ours comes out of the Canadian market. So when we have a strong dollar like we do now, that definitely affects kind of our prices and where we have to set those at. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? No, I don't think so. Okay, awesome. From the buyer side, so if we have a buyer who's looking for a certain thing, it's just like you said, I spend all day on the phone. I call grain millers, I call HESCO, I call Montana Milling. And you kind of just learn how to have your person who's in the know there, and you call them directly. And I do feel like it's more of an exact science for us. While there isn't a published futures market for organic grain right now, you call your elevator, you call everybody, it's a lot like conventional grain as far as it goes. But if we're working for somebody, or if a buyer contacts us and they want something that's special, very special, and they're willing to pay a premium for that, then that can be communicated to our farmer or our miller or our processor. So there's little variation when it comes to like specialty grain markets, but as far as organic grain pricing, for us on the buyer side, I do feel like it's a lot like conventional.
In the case of the O-Farm cooperatives, our marketers get on a call twice a month, and they share contracts, prices, information, weather conditions, and that sort of thing. And so somebody like Carmen, he makes one call. He makes it to his marketer, and he employs that agent to make that price discovery for him, and then he can make a decision as to whether he wants to market or not. There's a lot of factors that enter into this, as was mentioned, including imports. And right now, American or U.S. producers are getting the heck beat out of them on their price. 70%, possibly 90% of our organic soybeans are imported under a secret treaty with India that has no audit trail, and about 40% of our corn is being imported from areas of the world that the USDA's own Foreign Agricultural Service has cited rampant fraud. And what we're concerned about is producers, and what we've been working on over the last 18 months as we've seen this come, is the fact that you have, just as you heard from the certifier, that you need to have an on-farm inspection, a crop rotation, a plan. You need to keep all of the records, including back to the fields and the bins. And we have some serious doubts about that with our national organic program. And so we stand for fairness. We're not saying that all imports are bad, but at some point, something's going to come in here that somebody didn't catch, and it's going to blow up the whole market if we're not careful. But that price discovery mechanism is whether you spend all that time calling all those buyers yourself, or whether you make one call by hiring an agent.
Yeah, we'll just do it.
Is there anything the organic farmers can do about that politically? I mean, because we got new administration.
Can we let Miranda go first, and then I'll be glad to go back to that.
Sorry.
Okay, so from the Organic Valley side on price discovery, I have a sales team that works with me in the feed department, and they are doing exactly what we were just discussing here. They're making a lot of calls, they're talking to a lot of producers, they're talking to a lot of buyers. And that is how they're understanding like where the market's currently at. As I mentioned before, we have what we call the grower pool. And the grower pool has an executive committee. We meet with that executive committee on a monthly basis, and one of our main topics of discussion is pricing. Where should we be pricing our contracts? Where should we be pricing our spot contracts versus our long-term production contracts? And those aren't necessarily, long-term is a year, so it's not just a spot purchase, but we contract with them on a harvest cycle. And they're members of the cooperative, and as long as they are continuing to sign another year's production, and they're meeting the minimums and they're meeting the quality that we have, then they continue to maintain their membership. So really price discovery from the farmer's perspective, I would reach out and just start making phone calls, unless you are a member of a cooperative that's helping to market on your behalf. As John has pointed out a couple times, it's a lot more work as an individual farmer to go out and do that. USDA is starting to publish more prices. John did point out that those prices are somewhat behind. There's about a 2-week lag. The market more recently has been somewhat flat, so we haven't seen the fluctuations that we've seen in the past, but there always is the risk for having a lag and then missing a higher price potentially because of that. We typically know when those things are happening. We're listening to market signals in order to help inform our buying decisions, and the buying decisions we're making for our dairy farmers and the buying decisions we're making on behalf of our growers.
Okay. All right, you want to follow up on the import question, John?
The cost of imported corn, and we've had some importers tell us, is about $10.50 a bushel landed here. So why is your price $7.50 with some quotes at $6? Because they're using your low-cost grain to offset the high cost of the imports. And we are attractive in the world market because we have a high dollar, among other things. Now again, it's because we don't produce enough grain in this country. And so the market right now is kind of sending the wrong signal. It should be sending a signal to you that we need more domestic grain. But what the industry is doing by bringing the imports in is they're lowering the price and saying we don't need it. And here's what's happening, is that there are farmers that are shifting away from more corn and soybean acreage, just the opposite of what the market should have. They're shifting to alternative crops for, among other things, because they're more profitable and they don't lose as much money on organics. Now, what are we doing? First of all, we've been working on some letters to the House, Senate, and Agriculture Committee asking them to investigate this. We, on Monday of this week, filed there was an entity, a certifier called ETCO out of Turkey. Anybody know what's going on in Turkey right now? They got 32,000 people in jail. They fired 10,000 civil servants, and the U.S. Embassy has instructed all dependents to leave Turkey. You know who the biggest importer of corn, where the biggest source of corn is from? Turkey. Now, Turkey is actually a buyer of corn. So where's it coming from? It's coming from the former Soviet Federation, Russia, the Russian Federation, Ukraine, all of those.
But
Now,
there's no corruption in those countries.
pardon?
There would be no corruption in any of those countries.
Well, ETCO was cited for certifying 70% of the grain in the Ukraine, and they were decertified by the European Commission and Canada. Guess who hasn't, and they're still on the integrity database list? Our National Organic Program. They tried, and their case apparently was so bad, the administrative law judge threw it out. We have, and this has all been top secret, we found last Friday a settlement agreement that Miles McAvoy from the NOP, the head of deputy administrator, had quietly made with EDCO about certification. And so they're still certified. We have filed a Freedom of Information request to see what went wrong with those administrative proceedings. Because when the rest, we've been hearing since last March that they were decertified, not from our US, but when I was in Europe and when I've been in Asia. And in some cases, I have a friend that's a NOP accredited certifier in the Republic of Armenia that was looking at their agency for some of these other countries. Her comment was, it was too dangerous. And so our point is we've uncovered 2 bulk shiploads. That's the minimum that have come in. One came into Burns Harbor, Indiana, the 3rd week of May. Another one got docked out in the port of Olympia, Washington. We have pictures of those ships. We furnished and filed 2 complaints with the NOP about those ships as to whether they're actually credible or not. When I got a call from the compliance office from the NOP, we furnished them the port, the cargo, where it originated from, where it was ported in this country, and you know what the compliance officer's first question was? Where should we start looking? I said, how about call the Port Authority? And so there is no assurance at this point that any of the grain that's coming into this country, because we are one of the few countries in the world that does not require importers to be certified. Now, people like grain millers are a credible organization that are careful about it. Organic Valley's going to be careful about it. But there's a lot of others out here that if you wanted to go out and put up the money for a shipload of grain coming in here, you wouldn't have to do a thing except dock the ship and hope that the paperwork is all right. And as I said, the USDA has cited rampant fraud on certificates from Turkey. So what are we doing about it? Like I said, we're making farmers aware of it. We're working with some legislators about it, some of the other organizations like Northern Plains and also the Center for Rural Affairs, among others. And we also may have some state commissioners of agriculture writing out of concern for their producers as well.
This is the forum for the Moses.
At Moses on Friday, Mr. McAvoy has been invited to come out and face some farmers. And we hope that there's a good attendance from about, 3:30 to 5 on Friday afternoon. At the Organic Farming Conference. OFarm is bringing Andrew Trump, the general manager of Organic Arable from the United Kingdom, over to talk about the European perspective. But I've heard it in Asia and I've heard it in Europe. The United States is the easiest country to get organic grain into without being caught. And yet you'll hear from Mr. McAvoy how tough they are on the standards and how much money they collected. And so something's got to give here where we tighten up our standards. Again, what we're after is that those farmers should be on the same basis as you. It's not that the imports aren't going to come in to meet that growing demand, but the industry is going to have to get its act together that has got to pay farmers here a fair price if they want it from grown in the US. And otherwise, the trend is away from growing corn, and they're going to be even more dependent on foreign imports.
All right, thanks for outlining that, John. And just some more information about Moses also can be found, as I said, on the registration table, a little pamphlet that talks about what the main sessions are going to be there at Moses. So, Yulia had a question?
You guys mentioned the USDA report and how it always reflects local markets. There's a company called Macaris that we use. Are there other sources out there? Do you guys use Macaris or are there other things like that?
Yeah, go ahead.
The USDA and Mark Harris are both pretty much the best sources of that information at this point in time. We do work with Mark Harris quite a bit. We do provide pricing information to them, as we do provide trade information to the USDA as well. So they're contacting us. When we are contacting farmers and you guys, we know what's going on. So that's the only reason I say it's a lag, is because there's a little bit of that time delay. I'm not saying the price is not accurate. It's just maybe not quite as accurate today. It doesn't necessarily reflect local markets, as you pointed out. So local market discovery is very much still face-to-face. Yep.
I would like to mention, and grain millers can probably speak to this, most of the barley, specific to barley and oats, most of that comes out of Canada. Big buyers buy those out of Canada. So if you actually follow the Canadian oil prices, the grain prices follow those.
We've had considerable conversations with Macaris over the years. We do not do anything with Macaris, but the one thing to understand of what's in back of Macaris as well is that some of the people there, how many of you are in favor of a Chicago Board of Trade to trade futures on paper for organic? Our farmers stepped off that conventional wheel a long time ago. They aren't excited about going back. We have resisted anybody that has tried to tie a contract to the Chicago Board of Trade, and some of the people that are in Macaris have experience previously in setting up carbon trading credits. And so they've evolved into some other things. We do not supply them with that. We do have a good relationship with Heath Dewey. And if you come to the Moses Conference, there will be a workshop that he and I are doing. Heath is going to talk about how they're going to start regionalizing some of those prices, and is looking for input about how they can better serve organic producers.
Great, thank you. And Macaris was actually invited today. Lizzie Eckerberg was going to come but wasn't able to at the last. And correct me if I'm wrong, but just to clarify what Macaris does, what they do is twofold in a way. So they can both act as a buyer. They have online auctions, live auctions. They've started to kind of wander into that territory, but they can also be contracted by a company like OV for price discovery and for some kind of interpretation of markets. So they do both those things, just to clarify what they are. Next I saw Dylan.
I was just wondering, for those of us considering farming or transitioning, the fact that imports are driving down the prices of those core crops, is your gut feeling that they'll keep driving down those prices, or that loophole might close?
If I had my crystal ball, that is really the $1 million question, honestly. We don't know exactly where the floor is. And I mentioned we had seen the market flatten. I wouldn't say we've seen it go down significantly in the last year and a half. It's definitely flattened. John started to allude to part of what's going on, and it seems as if a lot of the imported product is hitting the east and the west coast. Obviously, that's an area that has the best access to it. So it's landing at the port somewhere between $10 and $10.50 a bushel-ish. You know, they usually go by ton prices over there, but if you convert it back, it's about that price. So why are farmers in the Midwest getting paid $7.50? That's a good question. In the past years, a lot of the grain in the Midwest moved to either coast. Well, the availability of corn on East Coast and West Coast now has reduced the natural pull from the Midwest, and therefore the price has flattened. Because before, you might get paid $10 or something for your corn, but by the time you get it out to the east, they're paying $13, $14 for it with freight. So that movement isn't happening as much as it used to. We're not seeing the natural draw out of the Midwest like we used to, and that's part of the reason why there's a gap at the moment between imported and domestic, if you will, or regional corn. So.
Great. Next question.
Erica, I noticed in your slides you had a significant dollar amount attached to specialty grains. So my question is for you and for Brianna, what specialty grains are encompassed in those generally, and like what's of specialty grains do you see that there's the most unfilled need for?
All right, so I'm our sales rep for distillers, maltsters, brewers, and then also a little bit on the feed side. So, something that I'm seeing, well, everyone's seeing, is this country hit the most number of breweries they've ever had in the history of this country last year. I don't have exact numbers, but I mean, look around. There's local breweries popping up everywhere. They are looking for local grains. They're looking for uncommon grains. They're looking to tell a story with their beer. They are, and distillers as well, maltsters as well. So as far as barley growing in the Midwest is really hard, as you know, but they do it, and they do it a lot in Michigan. So we're looking for barley that does well and meets specs for malting. And we're working with seed breeders, mostly out of Minnesota, to develop a barley that is fusarium resistant. So if you're interested in growing barley, or if that's something you're interested in, contact us. We can get you in touch with researchers and seed breeders. Other specialty grains that I've been looking at recently are blue corn. There's a market for pea protein right now, which is a legume, not a grain. But something right now, there's a lot of small mills popping up, especially in Wisconsin. So if you have any soft white wheat right now in storage that you'd like to sell, please contact me.
So to touch on, like I had that slide up there with specialty grains and how many acres that it takes to grow that. For us, that encompasses a lot of different things. A lot of times we end up with a couple hundred acres of this that we need to fill a customer's demand, a little bit of that. Like our soybean business would be encompassed into that. So there's a lot of different things that kind of fall under that category or that umbrella. So it's hard to really discuss it, too much. Really, what we are focused on and what we're trying to do is that soft white wheat, a little bit of barley, and oats. Oats are where we thrive and where we're going to push, especially our business, because as a volume and effort-wise, it is far and beyond anything else.
We deal with about 20-some different crops across the region, depending on where they're growing. The one market that seems to be emerging, maybe Miranda can comment on this a little bit, is seems to be at least a niche market in poultry for non-soy chickens that were raised with non-soy, and that appears to be one of them. One of our entities, they do buckwheat. There's spelt out there that's kind of give and take depending on the year, depending on what the imports are. But peas, both for feed and for food and for feed, are one of the hot things right now that a lot of producers are looking at.
So the non-soy eggs that John was alluding to, that isn't something we specifically label right now, but we have heard of people looking for rations that are non-soy. So what are they filling that protein component with? We believe, for the most part, it's peas, pea proteins, that sort of thing. There have been producers that have fed non-soy rations for a long time, and when we come across those, it's almost always a type of field pea protein that they're using to fill that protein need for that chicken. So.
There is also in Illinois, which isn't that far away from here, a wheat Growers Guild, I believe. And they are looking at various kinds of wheat, heritage brands of wheat. And somebody that you can ask about that tomorrow is Harold Wilkin is going to be talking, I believe, tomorrow about Janie's farm. And he's looking at putting in, I think he's already got a mill up and running, and looking at some of those heritage varieties of wheat. And so that is another place. A lot of, like was mentioned, these small bakeries, local bakeries are looking at these types of products.
I'm gonna plug one more thing, perennials. A lot of large companies like General Mills have come out with carbon sequestration goals for 2020 to, 30-35% is usually the range, and perennials, that they do that. So they're looking for perennials for feed, for organic bedding, and in any way they can incorporate that into their buying schematic in order to meet their carbon sequestration goals. So.
Great. And Bree mentioned malting barley. One thing I'll throw out as I was talking to the buyer at Breeze Malting, which is one of the biggest malt houses in the country, if not Midwest, and he said that they would love to be able to buy more local malting quality barley. So he's looking. They're starting to do some more of those contracts these days, so that's something to definitely look at. But relationship marketing, to get to kind of O-Farm's point, is also really important. So there's a farmer, Bob Stuchinski, who's up near Amherst, Wisconsin, I think, and he sells almost all of his barley to Central Waters Brewing there. And so he's made spec, I think, 6 out of the last 7 years. So he has a ready-made market, he knows they're gonna buy it every year, and that is security. And that's just something to think about as you're thinking about business marketing and relationship marketing as well. Any other questions? Go for it.
What do you mean by perennials?
Perennials. Perennials are crops that are not annuals, so they come up every year. Kernza.
What type?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. What do you mean by perennial? I thought you wanted a definition. I'm sorry. So Kernza, the intermediate wheatgrass, will come up 3 years in a row. Right now, there's a grant, like a super group grant with a bunch of universities on it, that is looking at this intermediate wheatgrass and a perennial rye. Perennial flax is already on the market. That's a thing that people grow in for food. And there's a couple other perennials out there that you can look up, but they are definitely beneficial. We're talking about, their super long roots systems and just maintain soil integrity and quality. So, yeah. And
sorry, go ahead.
And with like grain millers and OV and O-Farm, you guys do very large loads. I don't know, what's your minimum run, a truckload? Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, usually we try and at least get a semi-load coming into the mill. We definitely do partials. I'm not going to say we're not going to, but our goal is to have a full semi come into the mill. Otherwise, we try and pair you up with another grower for sure.
Okay, so my point is that we work with like a pallet, less than a truckload. So if you're just starting out, if you're just transitioning to organic grains and you don't want to take the huge risk and try to grow a massive amount of grain your first year, we can help you find a small buyer or small market for a pallet of grain, 2 pallets of grain, half a semi-load.
And Bree can correct me if I'm wrong, but just to give a little bit of background also about the Kernza, so it was developed by the Land Institute in Kansas. And so the idea is that they've been working for decades to try to have a grain that you don't have to till up and replant every year, the perennialized annual, and it's a revolutionary thing, and it is still in development is the really important part to note, that it is a saleable product, it's marketable, people are buying it. There's a beer that was made, Patagonia Provisions made that beer, but it's also something that is still in development, and so in 30 years, 80 years, 150 years, it'll be even more effective. So we're kind of on the cutting edge of this, just to point that out. You have comments about that?
If it's in development, isn't that by definition genetically modified?
It's just been bred using traditional, all breeding is modifying genes in some way to get at the semantic issues.
Yeah.
Question in the back?
Tediously bred.
Came up showed that you paid most attention for oats up into the Canadian region. Would it be safe to say that because of the environment here, that the quality of the oats would make it suspect as whether it would be usable for your purposes, or is it something that a grower could consider a reasonably good risk?
So we definitely source a lot of oats out of this area. It probably takes just a little bit more management and paying attention to how you're growing oats. Like Carmen was talking about, it takes knowing a few of those tricks just to make sure you make that test weight. We work with tons of oat growers out of the Midwest, down in through Illinois. We've sourced quality milling oats out of Missouri, and that's a long ways south. So I'm not ever going to tell you you can't grow oats in this area. It just takes kind of learning some of the tricks to the trade with it. The Canadians, they have a little bit short or a little bit cooler growing season, and that's what gives them, I guess, the edge in the production of oats. But absolutely, they can be growing down here, and I don't think you're taking on large amounts of risk by planting an oat crop.
Great. Got a question over here?
How are transportation costs factored into the prices that you give to farmers?
In the case of,
Is there a basis, or is the price at your mill, or is that the farm?
it's generally going to be what distance it has to go from your farm. And what our marketers do is they will factor that in the price that they quote. Now, in some cases, the buyer wants to pick it up at the farm, but in most cases, it's either you arrange the trucking, or in the case of the old farm marketers, that they have logistics firms that they work with. But then your responsibility is going to be, when that truck arrives on the farm, to inspect that truck to be sure that it has been thoroughly cleaned. We've had producers out in Kansas send a truck 50 miles to get washed because it wasn't clean, because you don't know what they were hauling previously. And if they were hauling a GMO load on those rails or on the cover, when they roll it back, you could have GMO dust dropping in as you're loading it. So that's one of the things that you're going to want to check with, and especially with your certifier, about how you can best minimize that. That isn't going to eliminate the GMO contamination, but right now, and it all depends. We've heard some freight rates come down. A year ago, you were competing against, of all things, grain trucks haul fracking sand. And all the trucks were going to North Dakota, and that didn't do very well for grain that needed to move here in the Midwest. So some of it depends on outside factors as well, but that's one thing that you'll want to discuss with your, whoever you sell to or whoever your agent is how will that transportation. That's another thing when it comes to contracting and what the delivery time for that factor is. If the delivery on your contract calls for between Christmas and New Year's, are we going to have weather like this where the trucks can possibly get bogged down? Who's going to be there to unload it? Because a lot of these places tend to shut down. And the other thing is the weight limits, especially in the northern parts of the U.S., that you don't want to be shipping out light loads because that's going to cost you extra too. So you want to pay attention to all of those factors, and either if you know a neighbor that trucks, that's fine. If you want to work with a marketer, or if you want to work with your buyer about whether you line up the trucking or whether they line up the trucking.
Comparing freight prices, if it's cheaper for like Montana Milling, or grain millers, if they'll just ship it direct from their facilities. If it's cheaper to do it that way, I'll book it that way. If it's YRC, if it's Speedy, if I go on to UShip, I compare every single freight quote and I just line them up into our system. We kind of use if you're familiar with Freight Flow at all, it's a software system that Wilbur Ellis uses, and we don't use Freight Flow. We kind of have our own version of it. So I'm able to automatically pull up what it would cost from point A to point B for every single shipper, and then whoever's quoting me the lowest price is who I go with.
Throughout the Old Farm network of those 19 states with the marketers, that the price that they're going to quote you is FOB the farm. And that's where you decide whether to pull the trigger on that price and that contract or not. And then they're going to take into account the freight and also the marketing costs. And our belief is that you as a farmer should be like every other businessman, that your cost of marketing and transportation is something that should be passed on into the marketplace. It shouldn't be something that's priced backwards.
John, could you unpack FOB, rate on board contracts, for people that might not be familiar with the grain world?
Well, it's like it's either priced getting it to the point of delivery, or it's free on board is priced at your farm gate.
We'll go back there and here then.
How are farmers paid in this? Where in the process does payment take place?
All right, I'll go really quick. So our buyer buys the grain, and they absorb those shipping costs and the management fees. So they are paid for their grain from our buyer, and then we just streamline the rest of the distribution, and the buyer also absorbs those costs. So that's our pricing schematic.
Typically, from our perspective, you're paid upon delivery of that grain. That's the way I think a good portion of buyers are going to do it.
So we also pay on delivery. We do arrange a lot of the freight, particularly for our forage producers. So once that truck picks up the load and leaves, as soon as we get delivery confirmation and settlement from the, not settlement, but approval of delivery from the purchaser, then we go ahead and make the, cut the check directly to the producer. Organic Valley is actually the one paying the forage producer. We're not brokering in between. So we pay them, we bought it, then we sold it back to the other buyer in that instance.
In the case here, we would like to see that 10 days. That's pretty rapid in the grain industry. A lot of times it's at 21 days. So you need to be planning. Don't call up your marketer. The worst thing you can do is call up your buyer or your marketer and say, well, next week I got to pay it my taxes. The other thing that comes into this is whether the buyer is credible or not. And you've got a guy sitting in this room over here that had what? How many? $35,000 sitting out on a buyer?
Yeah.
And if he wouldn't have had an accountant and an agent that went up there and negotiated, they went bankrupt, but he got his money. And that's another thing to look at, is that there's many veteran organic grain farmers that were left holding a check that was no good. So that's another thing that these services provide. And everybody up here is credible on that, but to check about the credibility of the buyer. We've had them go in the Old Farm Network and try and buy from one entity, so they were going to pay off the other entity that they owed within the Old Farm Network, and because of our communications, the buck stopped. So it's something to be careful of. The other thing is, Wisconsin has some very strict grain dealer and bonding laws and so on, which is good. Not all states have that.
What do you do to check their credibility as far as able to pay?
As far as you personally, well, no. You're not going to get that information out of them. You can maybe ask your banker to make a call.
What do you do?
Pardon?
What do you do as a company?
Well, there is some services you can subscribe to. Carmen's marketer subscribes to Dun & Bradstreet, which does do some ratings. There are some, I see Miranda shaking her head,
absolutely.
you shaking your head. There are some services, but you as an individual are not going to be able to afford to do that.
We started developing a history of buyers as well.
Yeah, everybody knows who's the good players and
Yeah.
who's the bad players. It's just like up here, you know who the good producers are and who are the ones that are likely to have problems with their grain too.
All right, we got a question here.
With non-organic crops, if I don't have on-farm storage, I can pay to have my stuff stored at the local co-op until it's time to sell. Is that type of service at all available for organic crops?
So one thing we didn't really get a chance to talk about much is infrastructure. And organic storage facilities, although they do exist, can be a little difficult to find if you're new to this. We'll be, in Cashton, which isn't too far from here. It's at not too far from La Crosse. There is a very large organic grain storage facility there, but he only takes in a certain amount of, or a certain type of grains. Mostly corn, soybeans, things like that. On-farm storage, if you are familiar with how to manage grain in a bin and are confident in that, is really your best bet. At this point in time, as far as other areas in the upper Midwest, there are some, usually it's somebody that knows somebody who has a grain bin, and they actually go through the process of having that neighbor's grain bin certified and cleaned out and checked out, and then they're storing grain, they're renting space there. I mean, there's a lot of different avenues for that, but it is a little bit different than the conventional world, and the infrastructure just isn't as pervasive yet.
It's going to, generally, our marketers encourage at least some on-farm storage so that you have no control of that grain once it goes in, as to whether on the farm you can keep it segregated, you can track it, and so on, that you have better control, you can monitor the condition of it as opposed to the commercial storage. And the other thing that you could run into at this point, typical of the conventional side, is that storage can be full at harvest time. And the second thing is that what we've run into with this import situation, we don't have any room. There's 2 barges of imported soybeans coming up the river to a buyer in Illinois. What do you suppose the room is he's going to have for local soybeans? And so storage is going to be to your advantage.
Kind of a short echo of both of these two. It's better to have some storage and have the plan to be able to store your grain at least for a short amount of time. We do have some potential for storage, but usually what we're trying to do is bring it in more as we need it, because we do have a limited amount of storage. So there isn't a ton of potential to bring in and store for you for long periods of time.
Yeah, this is an issue that comes up over and over and over again, and there are people taking necessary steps to address this. There's a organic feed mill going up in Westby, and oftentimes you can sell and then buy back your crops, but equipment and infrastructure is capital intensive. So if you want to off-put those costs, I'd say pre-plan, have a plan for your crops, have an intended market, have someone who's gonna take your raw product and get it up off the farm and into its next steps. If you don't have on-farm storage, or if you don't have the ability to store your crops on farm, because you won't be able to find organic grain storage in the Midwest.
The other thing you're going to want to be careful of in storage, this kind of weather can wreak real havoc on grain in a bin if you're not careful with the proper aeration and so on. And also that you reach a certain point in the year, especially the warmer months, starting in May on through, that you want to be monitoring that grain so you don't have an insect infestation, because that is going to be a disaster as well. So you want to, and again, how you do that is to talk to somebody that's done it, to get the hang of how to keep your grains in good condition as you go through. And some of our export markets, there are certain periods of the year during our summer months where they will cut off what shipments they'll take from here because of the high risk of damage.
So Miranda mentioned storage in Cashton. That's Cashton Farm Supply, CFS Specialties, with Ernie Peterson. The caveat that Ernie has said himself is that if you're storing anything there, it's commingled. So if you have a specialty product, if you have something of a certain quality, if you have a certain market for a heritage grain, an ancient grain, you're not going to get that market if you do commercial storage. It's all commingled. You can buy, quote unquote, your grain back. It's not going to be your grain. It'll be your grain mixed with a lot of other people's grain. So that's just a really important caveat with commercial storage. Question here.
When the prices that you're quoting, is that grain out of the field, or is that clean grain? And if it is clean, does the price change?
I'm glad you asked this question. I forgot to make this clarification. Like, our quotes are all food grade, so we have certain specifications on that. That doesn't mean it has to be cleaned. It can be straight out of the field, quote unquote, straight out of the field quality, but it has to meet those specs and be in the food grade quality.
Midwest Organic Farmers Co-op in Newton, Illinois, that's specifically what they do. There are some things that you can do on the farm based on screening that you have, and that's where you want to understand where your buyer's at. For instance, on soybeans, the different sizes of beans. Another thing is that if you do send it off and there is clean out, who gets that clean out, and is there any value to that to you? In some cases, if it's food, most of it went into food, and the clean out is there. There is a market for it in the feed market. So there's, again, all kinds of questions. Another thing goes back to how good you are and care you take in harvesting. Does it get dirt? Have you got dirt on the beans, as an example, where you had a mud them out kind of thing? Is there mold? Some years we have mold and rust in wheat and oats and also in corn and so on. So good conditioning, and sometimes there are some things that you can add just through your grain handling on the farm that will up the quality, especially things like being able to take out foreign material, weed seed, some of that thing. You're really going to get docked if you've got 7-8% foreign matter in there.
All right, I think we have time for one more question before we have lunch.
I'm curious what your organizations are seeing or working on in terms of markets for transitional products. Look at the back of
I gotta get going, so can I go first?
Absolutely.
I forget what cereal brand starts with K. They have a whole profile picture of a farmer talking about
Kashi.
transition.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you're seeing some things. I'm curious what you guys are.
Yeah, I actually have to take off pretty quickly, so I'm gonna go first. I was just at the MCIA meeting up in Fergus Falls, and Minnesota's coming out with their own label or something to that effect for transitional grains. And just to say, like, these are non-GMO, they're transitioning as a marketing tool for transitioning farmers. So that's great, and hopefully Wisconsin picks that up, and Illinois and the surrounding areas, because they are seeing a need for this, and they're seeing that people are receptive to that as a marketing tool, and buyers are receptive to that. So hopefully we'll see more in the last presentation by Mosa. She addressed that at a national level. They're also addressing that. Thank you. And my contact information is in your packet. Thank you, everybody.
To touch on this one a little bit, as I think most of you know or have heard, that the USDA has approved the label for transitional products. At this time, we aren't specifically sourcing any kind of transition, and for that to happen, we really need to have a customer or a food company come to us with the need or the desire to have one of these products, because until that happens, there really isn't much of an opportunity for transitional food products. We do buy transitional oats, trying to help out the producer a little bit. We try to give them just a little bit of extra premium, but for us, that all has to go into our conventional business and conventional processing at this time. So there isn't a lot of market there yet. Now, that being said, if more companies or more cereal brands or whatever it is decide that they want to have these products, the potential is there.
I could just speak to this briefly. So Organic Valley only markets 100% certified organic product at this time. We don't currently have a transition market, and that would be quite a departure, as we're a farmer-owned, farmer-controlled cooperative. That quite a departure from our previous, marketing arrangements. That's not to say that the conversations haven't happened, because we are, very well aware of the new label and possible marketing opportunities. But on the dairy side, it definitely presents some logistical challenges. Those producers are only in transition for 3 years. So any milk that we're getting off of that's a very quick turnaround when you're looking at developing routes and trying to trying to lease infrastructure in a certain part of the country, if we know that that milk pool is only there for 3 years, it's a little tougher. So from the marketing standpoint, there are some challenges, not to say that this isn't something that could develop in the future, but currently we don't have anything available.
O-Farm holds in trust for our member organizations a trademark, Sustainable Transition Verified. We've been talking about this for 2 years. It is being used on a small basis with Midwest Organic Farmers Co-op. There are some small, very small markets where people have the backyard poultry and they don't want the necessarily pay the price of organic. They would like the transitional. But to be perfectly clear here, there is a difference between transitional and non-GMO, because non-GMO does not mean that they can't spray the heck out of it or use chemical fertilizers. It only means that they used non-genetically engineered seed. What we're looking at, and our purpose in this is not because there's a big market transitionally for the grain, but we want to work with certifiers and hopefully develop a market that producer that decides from day one that they want to go organic, that they get used to working with a certifier in year 1, year 2, year 3, that they know all of the ropes by the time that they're ready to go full bore organic. And that's our primary purpose for Sustainable Transition Verified. But it is occasionally our marketers run into a load here and a load there, but it's something that definitely needs to be developed.
All right, and with that, we are gonna feed.
One question though.
Yeah, okay, quick.
Everybody's in favor of this transitional thing. But the only place that grain is gonna come from is certified acres. You know, okay, I'll buy transitional grain instead of the grain that's certified. Well, that just lowers the market for the certified grain. It doesn't increase our total market. Our total market is already there. That's the way it looks like to me, and all it's going to do is pull away from certified grains and not help.
It's an interesting point. I'm not sure I want to touch it, but I'm wondering if the panelists.
I'll touch it again if we need.
I'll
use both.
Go ahead.
I'm just gonna
We've run into people that have called us in O-Farm and said, we've got a product out here, we work with these farmers, and it's sort of in that transitional area. That's not our goal. We're 100% certified organic grain, and the only time that we may market some that is not is in this transition, with the ultimate purpose that they're going to be certified in 3 years, 100% certified organic.
I'm going to kind of bounce around this just a little bit. I don't want to necessarily answer directly, but
Yeah, I wouldn't want that.
I'm going to be a politician up here. But it's one of those things, kind of like John said, will probably work in the business as long as it's there, but our goal is to have the organic products. That's what we want, and that's the desire of the transitional program. If that's what it takes to get more farmers transitional and get more into the organic, that's what we'll have to do. But the real question is, is it going to devalue the organic label or the organic product is kind of a big question.
All right, I know I'm sorry. So huge round of applause for the panelists.